Hey, you're currently watching part 2 of a 2-part video. So, there's an annotation up on screen that will take you to part 1 because I'm going to jump right in. Alright. For those who aren't aware, the newer Fire Emblem games receive a lot of flack for having terrible stories, and I can definitely exactly see where this is coming from, as Awakening's plot had more holes than Swiss cheese, and Fates' plot was just a really big, convoluted mess. Now, I will give Intelligent Systems credit, as they did actively try to make Fates' plot a lot better than Awakening's. In fact, they hired manga writer Shin Kibayashi in order to do the story. I probably butchered his name there. Sorry about that, any of my Japanese-inclined viewers. But anyways, Mr. Kibayashi did his darndest to try and make Fates' story make somewhat semblance of sense. But, alas, it didn't really work out in the end, and we ended up with crappy villain Garen, crappy villain Lago, and discount Kylak. Now, personally, I think that they are onto something by hiring an outside writer, but Shin Kabayashi probably wasn't the best guy to do it, as I did a little bit of research on my own, and even though I can't understand Japanese, from what I understand of his previous works, just judging by titles and everything, Shin Kibayashi is more experienced in the horror genre rather than the fantasy genre, and I think that goes a lot into how stupid the Fire Emblem characters were in Fates, because, you know what, horror characters are often stupid as well, but I don't know, there might not be a correlation there. I definitely think, however, that hiring an outside writer to handle Fire Emblem's plotline is a very good idea. However, I think in order to try and stray away from all of the anime and moe and manga tropes that have seemed to taken over the franchise, I think we need a Western fantasy author to handle the story in the next Fire Emblem game. Now, I know this could be difficult for Intelligent Systems, but thanks to Fates and Awakening's great sales, they have the budget to do it. And if I might make a suggestion as to what Western fantasy author they should hire, I'm going to put my hat in the bin and say R.A. Salvatore. For those who don't know, R.A. Salvatore is famous for writing the book series Legend of Drizzt. Again, I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, so please feel free to correct me. But Legend of Drizzt is about a dark elf named Drizzt. Now, Drizzt is basically what would happen if you had Corrin in Nor, and he was actually well written, as Drizzt is a character who disagrees with a lot of the cruelty of the Dark Elf society, and then goes against it and rebels because he does not agree with it, thus making him practically a well-written Nor Corrin. I personally think that R.A. Salvatore would do wonders with a Fire Emblem story if he was given enough creative freedom. And to be honest, it would probably work to the franchise's benefits, but this is probably just wishful thinking, and I doubt it will actually happen. But if they do hire a Western fantasy author, make it R.A. Salvatore. Now, regarding specific story beats that I want included in Fire Emblem 15, there are 3 or 4 major things that I can think of. The first of which is make a Lord the main character. Please, oh please, we need this again. The Lord needs to handle the franchise, and Corrin, he didn't work. Let's be real here. When looking at Fates' story and characters as a whole, it almost seems, especially with the dual versions, that Ryoma and Xander were initially meant to be the main lords, and you would just play as Hoshido or Nor, and there would be nothing joining the kingdoms. It would just be one or the other, and they would parallel each other, and I think that would have made Fates' story a lot better, which is especially cool considering that Ryoma and Xander are arguably the 2 best written characters in the entirety of Fates. Now, a Lord should be given helm of the series once again, and this is the reason why. The Avatar cannot handle the story because that their nature. They need to be an avatar, they need to be relatable, and they need to be a blank slate for the player to relate to them. This cannot be done for a main character, because if a main character needs to be a blank slate who doesn't develop, then they can't handle the role of a main character, in the sense that if they don't develop, they can't follow an arc, and thus they remain stagnant throughout the story, which leads to a very poor narrative as a whole. The second thing that I want to see implemented in a future Fire Emblem game is for them to fix up the villains. Fates' villains were lost potential, Awakening's villains were just trash. We need to step back and go back to a formula that works. One of the things I noticed about the GBA games is that when in regards to the villains, they often had a very strong and definite hierarchy, in the sense that you had the major villains, such as, let's use Lion in Sacred Stones for the example, and then you had a secondary cast of villains, possibly 4 to 5, who acted as sort of an evil crew, so to speak, that sort of worked as villains for most of the story, those being Valter, Kylak, Selena, Glenn, etc. Those characters who, yeah, them. A system like this being implemented into a future Fire Emblem game would benefit the narrative as a whole, as you could still have distinct arcs, but you could still have the main villain following the entire story at all times. And the third thing regarding plot that I think needs to be implemented is more importance on units and minor characters. Fates and Awakening were very, very biased towards a small group of main characters, while in the older games, you got to see faces of a lot of the other characters a lot more. In fact, Awakening even had a joke character based on this concept in the form of Kellum, who was completely invisible, and this is a commentary on the fact that Fates and Awakening only focus on a small cast, despite having one of the largest unit rosters in the entire series. Make someone like my early game Killing Edge Myrmidon important, like Joshua was in the Sacred Stones. Make someone like the mercenary I get important, like Raven was in Fire Emblem 7. Do stuff like that to give more variety to the cast and who speaks up. Fates, I think, is slightly less guilty of this than Awakening. However, this is just a side effect of the fact that Fates had pretty much exactly 10 characters who were all sort of at the level that Chrom, Lucina, and Robin were in Fire Emblem Awakening. Those being, of course, the 8 royal siblings, Corrin and Azura. Additionally, while more of a gameplay complaint rather than a story complaint, in the next Fire Emblem game, when it comes to hiring units, I want to have a bit of a puzzle to figure out. I don't want to see a unit on the battlefield and be like, oh, hey look, let me just get my avatar to talk to you, and look, now you're hired. I want to sort of think it out a bit more methodically. Make it so that in order to hire certain characters, I have to have another character in my party at the same time. I have to talk with a specific character who isn't the main lord, or I have to talk to that unit with multiple characters even. Something like that to just make getting a unit feel rewarding. Don't make it feel like, oh hey look, here's another guy I can bench next chapter. And a little last thing regarding the plot, keep it simple. Fates tried way too hard, Awakening didn't try at all. You need to go somewhere in the middle. This is why stuff like Fire Emblem 7 and Fire Emblem the Sacred Stones have what many people consider some of the most well-rounded narratives in the series, because they're simple, but they're deep at the same time. This way they aren't a giant story that is hard to keep up with like Radiant Dawn, or a minimalist, simple plot like Awakening. This works in the favor of those two games specifically. So with that all being said, in regards to the villains, the story, and how it should be executed in Fire Emblem 15, I think the most fitting way to try and put this all into perspective is to give an example of what my sort of dream Fire Emblem 15 would be, following gameplay and story. So keep in mind that the following part of the video is by no means polished, and revolves around a rough narrative that I pretty much drew up in maybe, I don't know, an hour or so. So it's not exactly an Oscar-winning ballad, but I think it'll get the job done to help me convey my point. This game will exist in a completely separate universe from any other Fire Emblem game, much like Sacred Stones. The plot will start with an overlay of the continent, much like the GBA games, where we'll learn about the various rulers, the various nations, and what shaped the continent to be as it was. For this example, I'll be using 4 nations, which I refer to as Langbalt, Artenac, Austria, and Kol. Now, in order to kick off the story, we'll start with a war between Artenac and Kol. Kol will be, think of it as sort of the bad guy nation, and Artenac being your good guy nation, much like the Lycia and Burn dynamic in Fire Emblem 6. Now, we first meet the Lord of Artenac as he's receiving word that Langbalt will not be helping the war effort against Kol, so basically he must charge in blind. So then he goes to his son, which is our main character, who will then start marching towards Kol, where he will encounter a few of the early game units, the Red and Green Cavalier, etc., and most of it will play out for the first 10 chapters, just getting to Kol and fighting and stuff like that. Around chapter 11, a huge battle will take place between Artenac and Kol on the plains of Austria, who is now caught in the middle. Austria, of course, looking for a peaceful situation, is caught in the middle, and as such, when it happens, the Kol and Artenac fight, but Kol has a secret weapon in the sense that they are being backed up by a mercenary group. Think similarly to the Black Fang. Now, this mercenary group will start by assassinating the King of Artenac and then heavily wounding the Queen of Austria. The assassin, similar to Jafar, will then hightail it out of there. After this, you then take out Kol's forces in this chapter, and then afterwards, the game will sort of split down the middle in the sense that you now have to worry about Kol and the mercenary group, as well as Langbalt, who is now turned traitor and is now trying to clean up the mess now that the nations are war-torn and just sort of take over the continent as a whole. Now, this won't affect however many chapters you have. This will actually affect the order at which you play them. And as such, if you play certain chapters against the Kol army and the mercenary group first, you'll be locked out of units in the other path and vice versa. This way it requires and encourages multiple playthroughs in order to get all the units, and we can still have some replayability and some story variation without having to go into a dual version setup. And I think this is a good compromise. And of course, after you finish taking out both Kol and Langbalt, you'll then go to a final chapter where you'll then take out some sort of big bad. I'm probably going to say it's the King of Langbalt, or possibly the leader of the mercenary group, staying away from the supernatural entities, because I think that the whole Dark Dragon thing, the Demon King thing, or whatever, has just been overdone in the series as a point, as really the only final boss who isn't supernatural related is Ashnard. So I think another final boss that's more human than anything else would do the series some good. Personally, I think a game set up in a similar way to that would be excellent. With all of the gameplay measures and the story that I just laid out, that would be a game that I would play in a heartbeat, and I think would please both new fans and old fans. And as for child units, well, that's what we have the post-game for. As why not have an FE4 style set of maybe 10 chapters where you follow the children? I think that's good, because then we don't have to go into a side story to get them and stuff. I think that's good. So, if you like this video, you can go ahead and give it a thumbs up, and if you want to let me know what you want out of Fire Emblem 15, drop a comment down below, or better yet, make a response video. I'd be happy to watch it. With that all being said, I have been ZerkMonsterHunter 4. Thank you all for watching, and no matter what games you like to play, happy hunting.